Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show, The Nation Talks. You're now well into the second century of our shows. I'm John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And again, as I say almost every week, thanks to you, the TNT Show and all India Live off, because there are many shows on this channel, and I would strongly urge you to go and check them out. They're growing and we're delivering more exciting shows than ever before. Not a claim that the BBC could necessarily make, but here we are, India Live, which relies entirely on your support. We're growing and the shows are growing and they're getting better. And you can watch the TNT show, of course, on indialive.net. It's streamed out to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Plus, you can see all the previous shows, well over 100. What an offering. What's not to like, as they say? Well, you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. While Labour, south of the border, declare they are utterly and wholly opposed to Tory policies, we hear that Labour in Edinburgh has suspended 2 of its councillors. Why? Because they would not agree to join with the Tories in a great deal to keep the largest party, the SNP, out of control of the council. I mean, I'm not sure how sustainable this sort of divided communications process is, but you have to ask the Labour Party why they think this is clever. Tonight, we are talking to 2 very special guests. We'll be discussing Wales. Wales. I mean, you know, how often do you hear Wales being discussed anywhere across the UK media? Very seldom. Even less than Scotland features. And I suspect, like Scotland, most of that discussion is ill-informed. We're going to try and correct that tonight. We'll be talking Wales with Carrie Harper, a councillor at Wrexham, and Llywelyn Abdullah. My apologies, I don't know if I've mispronounced any of your names. They are huge supporters of the cause for independence for Wales. And they're here for a full hour, and they're taking your questions live. And there's still time to get your questions considered. You can find all the details online. As you know, the TNT stands for The Nation Talk. So, as I often say, this is your show. We welcome your questions. Please take the chance to ask them. We're live and we're free. So no license, not a problem. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks to Carrie and Llywelyn. Thanks so much for joining us. How are you? Starting with Carrie, please.
I'm fine, yeah. I'm having a good day.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Carrie, and then we'll talk to Llywelyn.
So I was first elected as a county councillor for Plaid Cymru back in 2008. So my background before that was campaigning. There were a lot of issues with housing, locally affordable housing, overdevelopment, that type of thing. But when I first got elected to the council, I had no political knowledge or background whatsoever. So it was a little bit of a baptism of fire, you could say. But I came to the conclusion pretty early on, really, that even with devolution, what we had with Labour at the time was a party facilitating their orders from Westminster. They weren't making decisions based on what we needed here in Wales. And, you know, that was true in devolved areas as well. So I very much saw them as part of the problem. And I came to the conclusion pretty early on that what we needed ultimately was independence. And that's where we needed to go. And my experience over the last few years really have just reinforced that view.
Now, I think what's interesting and what our audience might not know, that in 2022, Plaid Cymru gained 6 seats in your council. Is that right?
Yeah, so we went from 3 councillors up to 9. We had a really energetic local campaign. We're really sort of making grounds in what are traditional Labour heartlands. And we're seeing people making that switch from Labour over to Plaid Cymru and increasing numbers, as well as the local election. We had the Senedd election, obviously, as well, where we doubled our vote in Wrexham. So it really is a growth area for the party. So we're seeing a lot of movement.
Well done. Llywelyn, turning to you, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. So look, I was born in Cardiff, but as you can probably tell from the accent, I've spent a lot of my life living in London. And I guess even though I was brought up in quite a politicised family, so both my parents were heavily involved with Plaid Cymru, I guess I never really thought much about politics, probably like quite a few of my peers. But I think supporting Welsh independence has always just been a given, probably given the household I was brought up in. But I think I moved back to Cardiff almost 4 years ago now. And I think having moved back, I started questioning and thinking why I supported independence. So I think the independence came first, and then the why has now followed. And since moving back to Cardiff, I've been more and more involved in the movement for independence in Wales, and set up all under one banner about 4 years ago now. And so yeah, here I am, looking forward to talking about our march on Saturday in Wrexham.
Yeah, so you'll be marching through Wrexham. I gather there was some opposition from the local manager of your council to the march, but that's been any political involvement has been rigorously denied, and you're pressing ahead and you're meeting where you plan to meet, and I wish you every success with that. Tell us a little bit about AUOB Cymru. Because you've got a fairly big geographical area to cover. How do you keep it all together? How do you get people all facing in roughly the same direction?
Yeah, so look, it's a great question, and I think, for obviously a lot of the viewers up in Scotland, you'll be familiar with all under one banner, albeit kind of the Scottish flavour of it. And yeah, in 2019, had some conversations with friends and colleagues up north, and decided to set one up in Wales. I think we take a slightly different approach in Wales than you do up in Scotland. We've got quite a loose central group of volunteers, and we rely almost entirely on volunteers in the location that we're going to have a march. So while I'm based in Cardiff and did a reasonable amount of organising for the first one, the second one in Carnarvon, the third one in Merthyr, and the fourth one now in Wrexham relies entirely on volunteers in those areas organising events which reflect the local area. I'm not from Wrexham. It wouldn't make sense for me to try and organise something there. Carrie lives and breathes the town, right? It makes much more sense for her to organise it there. So I think, while we centrally try and support the people in those locations as much as we can, or as much as is needed, because actually, in quite a lot of instances, we don't need to give that much support. And I guess that the one benefit I would say of having something a bit centrally is, we can rely as well on our friends up in Scotland who've been through it, a lot more so than we have, for support and advice. And there's probably a really good example recently, as you mentioned, when we had quite strong pushback from the council. And I'll let Carrie talk much more about that particular instance, but it was great to be able to get on the phone to my friends up in Scotland and say, well, I know you've had pushback in the past, how best should we deal with it? How have you dealt with it in the past? What should we do? What maybe shouldn't we do?
I think the objection, Carrie, was that it was political.
Yeah, Wrexham Council have got this weird protocol in place, really, that doesn't make much sense, that says they won't allow political events, they won't allow events that promote an individual or an organisation. But just in the last couple of weeks locally, they've allowed the use of the land for the Jubilee celebrations, for Armed Forces Day. So it didn't really make any sense. So we challenged it on that basis, and obviously just on basic human rights legislation and freedom of assembly, freedom to of expression. And they've said they've reviewed it in light of that, and they're going to sort of make an exception, basically. But obviously these rights are universal, so that's something that we will take up with the council longer term, I think, in terms of reviewing that policy, because I don't think it's even lawful in terms of where it stands at the moment. But they have backtracked, and I think maybe they've realised that they need to give that policy a bit of an overhaul, I think.
I gather that part of the revision process was they were concerned that they might not be supporting free expression.
Yeah, well, it comes down to the human rights legislation, Articles 10 and 11, doesn't it? In terms of our right to hold the parade and the event. And I think when they've looked at that and that's been pointed out to them, they've decided to take another view. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic in some respects because the human rights legislation is about to be filleted at Westminster. So the very articles that you appeal to may no longer be valid or legal in a few months' time, perhaps.
They may not, but it's that basic principle, that basic democratic principle, isn't it? And that you can't pick and choose things that you're going to allow based on personal preference. Those protocols have got to be legitimate, and everybody's got to have the same opportunity. So I think it's sad to think that some of these things may take a step backwards, but hopefully on a local level we can embed those principles as something that's a core part of the decision-making process. I hope so, anyway.
Is it the case, Llewellyn, that I'm using the term loosely here, but unionist politicians, i.e. Labour, Conservative and Lib Dems, tend to take a unified position in opposition to Cymru, Plaid Cymru and others? Is that the case?
No, I mean, look, when we talk specifically about the organisation of marches and events, right? I think actually, and I'm really glad to say this, we've had really good responses from most of the councils, the police, the volunteers, the stewards, and all of that kind of all of those groups of people. We've had really good support in most of the places. And look, again, I'm no expert on the inner workings of Wrexham Council, but I'm glad that they've now changed their position, and I can say that we've still got a pretty positive response from all of those stakeholders that we're working with.
Yeah.
In the broader sense, I think actually Wales is a bit more of a nuanced picture than that. I think obviously you've got Plaid Cymru and the Greens, let's not forget, who are clearly they're supportive of independence. We've got the Conservatives on the other hand, who clearly do not support independence. You've got the Lib Dems who are more towards the Conservatives, but talk about some sort of a federal arrangement. Not that that's ever likely to happen. But then actually the Labour Party in Wales is currently walking this kind of tightrope, and they're doing quite a good job of it, of not being clearly out for independence, but also not being clearly out for the union, and kind of pushing for more powers, kind of not. And I think, in part, that's in response to the fact that actually in Wales, around about 50% of Labour supporters support independence, which is a really healthy number.
Yeah.
And, I think, whether they can move the party, I think, that's going to be the key question in Wales over the next few years.
You raise a very interesting point, because in some respects, what is happening in Wales is magnified in terms of what happens in Scotland. The Labour Party went on a journey around about 2014 when they opposed independence. They never opposed the democratic right of people to choose. They simply put the case that independence was a very bad choice. This time round, they're actually opposing the democratic choice. They're saying we don't want people to have the opportunity to choose. That's got nothing to do with independence necessarily. It's got a lot to do with whether you believe in democracy or not. And what they seem to be saying is that they don't believe in democracy in some respects, but completely in other respects. So it's a very partial approach. And I'm just wondering if that position might emerge in Wales.
I think that a couple of good examples of maybe how Labour in Wales is different to Labour in Scotland. And, I think you can over-egg the differences, absolutely right. But I think, the first thing to say was that there were some candidates for Labour in the last Senedd elections who overtly supported independence. You can argue that they were, running in places where they were never going to win, or they were so far down the list they were never going to get a seat in the Senedd. But actually, the fact that that even happened, 10 years ago would have been unheard of. And then I think the second piece, and again, you could take this either way, and I'm, for once, I'll put a positive spin on things, right? Labour are currently have set up a commission to look at the constitutional future of Wales. And, while they've made their position clear, which would be a federal settlement, independence is on the table. So, I think things are up for grabs at the moment. I think we saw yesterday, Westminster, or the Conservative government in Westminster, have said that they're going to roll back Welsh law when it comes to trade union law. This feels like a really important point, and I think right now Labour could go one of two ways, putting a positive spin on it, or maybe trying to be positive about things. I would hope that they would be open to having giving the people of Wales a real democratic say.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, Labour's position in Scotland, as I say, seems to change a lot. And it sort of depends very much who the leader is. Most of the previous leaders have struggled and failed to grasp the nettle, as it were, or the thistle. They have come up with all sorts of interesting propositions, but the one they've never come up with is a federal system, which you indicate is their position in Wales. Why do you think a federal system would not work for Wales? Wouldn't it give you most of what you want?
I don't even think it's a case of whether a federal system would work for Wales or it wouldn't work for Wales. The honest truth is, right now, the Labour Party in the UK has no interest in instituting a federal settlement. Therefore, it's a non-starter. Yeah.
It's interesting when I ask right of centre supporters on the show how they feel about being in favour of the status quo. The strongest answer I get, in fact, it's almost universal, is that we're not in favour of the status quo. We want a federal system for the UK. And when I ask them how will that work, bearing in mind that I don't think anyone at Westminster has the slightest enthusiasm outside the sort of Plaid Cymru and the Greens and the SNP for any change in the constitutional arrangements. And besides, why would anyone in England want things completely altered for the sake of people that they never meet? It just sounds like an extraordinary position to take, but that's the one that seems to be taken by and large. We've had a question, and the question is, would an independent Wales hope to join the EU? You want to take that one, Carrie?
That'll be up to the people of an independent Wales, wouldn't it? Ultimately, I think that's a big question on a personal level. There's an obvious answer for me. I voted Remain. I think it's the obvious way forward because of the economic situation in Wales and the amount that we export. It makes sense economically for us to rejoin the EU. But that would be another big discussion, I think, with the people of Wales, obviously, who didn't vote for that option during the last EU referendum. I think views have changed quite substantially since then, though, I'll be honest, and we're now starting to feel the pinch, certainly in terms of Brexit. That's starting to bite. I'm seeing that on a local authority level with issues getting materials and lots of different impacts. So I think the mood has changed, but ultimately that would be a question for the people of Wales.
And one of the concerns that people of a non-independent position take in Scotland regarding any form of independence or separation is that there would have to be a border, particularly there was any prospect of joining the EU. How would that work in Wales?
Very good question, very big question. We're already seeing the impacts, of course, in ports such as Holyhead anyway. So we're already seeing the implications of being outside the single market. Again, these are big questions that will have an impact. It'll have an impact in Scotland as well, and I'm sure it'll be a big core part of the discussion in the run-up to the second independence referendum, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, our interests are, in my view, best served being part of that single market. And yes, there are challenges that will come with that because of the decision to leave the EU. So there are questions to tackle, but that is the reality that we face. So again, a conversation that we will have to have.
Has Wrexham been particularly badly affected by Brexit?
Yes, in the sense of, as I say, I've seen certainly on a council level, there have been issues in terms of sourcing materials for various council contracts. So there's an impact there. There's been an impact from local businesses as well in terms of exporting goods. So people are definitely seeing the impact. I mean, obviously, anybody who's tried to go on holiday recently and gone to Manchester Airport would have seen the implications there in terms of staff shortages as well. So I think it's that sort of lag in terms of seeing that economic impact, but it is starting to bite. It's been masked, of course, isn't it, because of the pandemic as well. So there is a job of work to do, I think, in terms of separating out what is the impact of the pandemic and what is the impact of Brexit. But definitely, it's starting to bite.
Llywelyn, thank you. Llywelyn, could I ask you, one of the features that we've noticed increasingly in Scotland is the amount of overt warmth being displayed by EU countries in talking about an independent Scotland. Are there such connections active in Wales? Can you tell me? I mean, do politicians meet with people from or go to EU centres, even though Brexit has impeded that process?
I think so. I think it's probably less clear than it is in Scotland and with Scottish connections, right? Because I think, frankly, Wales is, the poor relation both within the UK, but also consequently further afield. So I think, for example, I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people that there is actually, quite strong support for independence in Wales. So yeah, I don't think it's quite as overt as maybe it is for Scotland, but I think, there are certainly links and, ever-growing links. And, I think certainly people who are advocating for independence, we're not advocating to be, separating ourselves or, taking ourselves away. It's about taking our place in the international community. So those links are, incredibly important. And, anything that we can do now to start building, stronger ties with, other European countries, but also further afield, I think, should be done right now.
Do you experience any of the criticism that used to be leveled at the independence movement in Scotland, which is that you're anti-English? This is also, by the way, leveled at the folks we interviewed last week in Cornwall. They're often accused of being anti-English, or that you're planning to divide families and friends. Have you heard this sort of stuff, Carrie? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, I mean, it's often something that's just chucked into the conversation to shut down discussion as well, where there are legitimate issues to debate. I mean, where I live, we have a lot of cross-border connections. We're an hour away from Liverpool, about the same distance from Manchester as well. So there is a lot of cross-border movement. There's cross-border movement in terms of healthcare and things like that as well. And obviously, we're managing those situations under devolution. We manage those situations pre-devolution as well. So those connections are organic. They develop over generations, and they'll carry on after Wales is independent as well. And I think being pro-Wales, talking about the opportunities that there are for us as an independent nation, does not make us anti-English. And I think Certainly on a local level, we've got a lot of English members, we've English people who stand in to represent Plaid Cymru at a council level. My dad's a Scouser, he's joined Plaid Cymru. So I think that accusation is becoming less and less. I heard it more 10, 15 years ago, and I think it's been, once you sort of peel it back, it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. So it's something that's being chucked at us less and less.
Do you think if there were to be an independent Scotland, that would have an impact on the impetus that Plaid Cymru, the increased impetus that Plaid Cymru might enjoy?
I think so. And I think polling has shown that where Scotland to be independent, support for independence in Wales goes up. So there is a connection. I think people are watching with interest. So yes, I think the discussion in Scotland, even pre-referendum, is having an impact. People are paying more attention to the issue of the Constitution, obviously seeing the discussion on the news, on Question Time over the last few years is making people ask these questions that they maybe wouldn't have asked, say, 15 years ago. So the conversation is definitely a more normal part of conversation than it would have been when I first got involved in politics. And a big part of that is because of the Scottish conversation, undoubtedly.
Okay. Llywelyn, do you see a political career ahead for you?
Define political, I think we could all argue that we're
with a capital P.
Politically involved as we are.
I was thinking with a capital P. I mean, do you have any desire to be First Minister of Wales?
I have no burning desire to be the First Minister of Wales. No, I think. Look, I think with a lot of people, particularly in the independence movement, it's about why are we involved in the independence movement? Why are people activists, right? And it largely comes down to how can we support independence. I support independence because I want a better life for people in Wales, and further afield, right? I think the same argument holds. And I think, do I see a political career? Almost certainly not. Wouldn't never say never, but almost certainly not. But I think, it's whatever you can do in, your circumstances in order to push that those interests forward to make things better. And I think, at the moment, I've carved a little niche for myself doing this that, isn't going to last forever. Whether it's capital P political, I doubt it at the moment, put it that way.
The thing is, once you have a position of visibility, which you now have, the likelihood is that people will come and knock on your door because you're clearly very bright, articulate, and people will look to you. It's like a prospective candidate. It's bound to be the case. I'm sure the same thing happened with you, Carrie. People spot talented people early on and they think, oh, great, if we could just persuade Llywelyn to stand in such and such and such and such. But you still wouldn't respond to these overtures if they came your way?
No, I mean, I don't have a particular yearning for the limelight, and I think if I can use whatever ability that I have, and you're very kind to say that, John, to further the cause and to further other people and to help other people further the cause, then I'm more than happy playing that role.
Oh, that's terrific. That's a super political answer, isn't it, Carrie?
Yeah, and I suppose, you know what? I think, having organisations like AUOB Cymru and Yes Cymru, it does open the door to people to get involved in the movement who don't necessarily want to walk through a political door. I think there is a difference, and I've seen a lot more people, especially younger people, I think, get more involved in the independence movement because there's that broader base and broader access. So I think that's a really important role as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about young people because we've actually, Indie Live has plans to have a 16-year-old with their own show to talk about independence. And one of the reasons for that is because when I interviewed him, he had a starring role in the BBC Question Time, I think it was. There was nobody representing his age group. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, we plow millions into the broadcast media. And he's telling me nobody talks for me. And you think, gracious. and in Scotland, in the referendum, certainly 17-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. And the notion that there wasn't any vehicle that they could talk to each other in this form, it's shocking, really. I mean, it's like we got a broadcast medium that just doesn't broadcast. It almost narrowcasts. It sort of aims itself at people over 50 in large part. Certainly that's the experience in Scotland. It's you don't see too many young faces. There's a dearth of women accepting. Here's Jenny, who's going to talk about horse riding in the royal family. It's not politics. It's not about food banks. It's not about how we're going to grow the economy. It's all very sort of niche, and you get the impression there's a whole bunch of sort of rather stale males running the whole operation in Scotland. How do you find the media in Wales as it affects Plaid? Carrie?
I suppose our experience is it's always harder to get a look in, isn't it? And there's been a debate in Wales for a long time about the need to strengthen Welsh media. I think there's been progress over the last few years. We've got nation.cymru as an outlet now. We've got the National. We've got a lot more online activity, and social media has changed the game anyway, hasn't it? A lot of our local campaigning for the last council election was through Facebook, which wouldn't really have been an option when I first started campaigning. So we've got to adapt to all these different platforms as they turn up. I wouldn't have a clue with TikTok, for instance, as a massive reason to have younger people involved with the movement, because obviously they understand these platforms on a different level. But I think in Wales we've still got a way to go. Our media isn't strong enough, and certainly I've stood in Westminster elections as well, and that's where you really feel. And I'm sure, in Scotland it's the same, really drowned out that there's just these, big two political parties, Lib Dems chucked in sometimes, and very difficult for parties like Plaid Cymru to get a look in. I think, some of the arguments over the debates in some of the Westminster elections have helped change that a bit, seeing the SNP have a platform and Plaid have a platform. So there's some progress, but it could easily be rolled back, couldn't it, as well? So I think we've got to make the most of the social media options, which we can't be shut out of, but there's still a long way to go with traditional media to make sure that our voices are heard.
If there were, it's a question for Llywelyn now. I know you're not invested in a political career, but in the broad sense, Llywelyn, of looking at politics, and I'm sure you look at it very thoughtfully. If there was a general election tomorrow, the likelihood is that though the Conservatives might well lose, in inverted commas, i.e. they would have fewer seats than a combination of Labour and other parties. Do you think there's the political nous in the Labour Party to understand that they need to combine with others in order to govern? Or do you think they feel confident that if there was an election, they would have an overall majority of seats at Westminster? What's your take on that?
No, look, I think, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer appears to be reasonably rudderless. I think it's quite clear that they don't begin to understand the situation in Wales or Scotland. If you look at Wales, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a Labour supporter, but Mark Drakeford is the most popular leader in the UK by a country mile. The Labour Party in Wales has been in power in Wales, or the largest party in Wales, for over a century. But UK Labour have no interest in trying to understand why that is. So no, I think Labour would almost certainly seek to go it alone, potentially in some sort of agreement with the Liberal Democrats. I think the price for any sort of agreement with the SNP would be too big. I think, frankly, the other parties in Wales would be too small. But I would, a Labour government in London what does that change? Does that suddenly make people's lives significantly better? Sure, we'll almost certainly get rid of a degree of sleaze and a degree of incompetence that we've seen with the current Conservative administration. But is it actually going to affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis? Are people going to, materially feel better? I'd say under Keir Starmer, the answer is almost certainly not. So I think then you have a question whether, Conservatives or Labour in power in London, for Wales and for Scotland, will actually do people who maybe aren't convinced yet begin to look at that other path.
Interesting. Carrie, how do you feel? You mentioned that people who voted to leave, that are now taking a softer approach and perhaps are more inclined to think that was a mistake and that Brexit was a mistake. If I'm not paraphrasing your words too much, I hope I'm not. Do you think there might be? Do you think the fortunes of groups like Plaid Cymru will be positively affected if the outcome of Brexit continues to be as problematic as it is at present?
I suppose.
Bearing in mind, sorry, that Wales voted to leave.
I mean, how closely that's linked to how well Plaid Cymru does and in what particular elections, I'm not sure. I think what will have an impact is how the Brexit repercussions are handled. That's where the focus is now, obviously, in terms of the UK government and the performance of Boris Johnson. Generally, I think people are just seeing the shambolic nature of government in Westminster at the moment, and that applies equally to Brexit as well. So in terms of that issue, I think that would probably have more impact on their sort of political direction of travel, more so than, I think that they're impacted by Plaid Cymru in terms of the work that we're doing on the ground. And we've seen that in Wrexham. We saw that in the last council election. So I don't necessarily see a direct link between our electoral performance and Brexit issues. But I still think that Brexit will be, the impact of Brexit will play a part in shaping people's political views on a local level and across Wales as well.
Do you think that Labour at Westminster have made a mistake by pinning their colours to Brexit and saying we will not seek to ameliorate or reverse Brexit in any way, shape or form?
I think it's the start of that shift in the Labour Party that we've seen sort of since Corbyn. Obviously, Corbyn was leave anyway, but just this move towards the centre, this move to appeal to this vote in England, and I think it highlights for me the fact that to a large degree, voters in Wales, in Scotland, we're just not a priority. And so Brexit is one example, but we're seeing it over a number of different areas. We're seeing it in terms of obviously the trade union discussions in recent weeks as well, that Labour really just haven't got a message. They're trying to appeal to a vote, and the problem for them, with that is they end up standing for nothing. And I think that's where Labour is. I think Llywelyn's already, summed that up in terms of Keir Starmer. If Keir Starmer is in charge in Westminster, then, what benefit is a Labour government to us in Wales, apart from maybe being slightly less chaotic and shambolic than the one we have under the Tories with Boris Johnson? But, I think Labour are very much Tory light in terms of London politics.
There's an argument that says that you have to be Tory light in order to get elected in England.
Well, there we go, and then this is where we get to the nub of the problem, isn't it? That these two parties, both Labour and the Tories, have always got that basic conflict of interest when it comes to the devolved nations, and we're seeing that highlighted more and more.
Can you clear up something for us in Scotland? And that is, many people are confused as to why Wales, unlike Northern Ireland and Scotland, voted to leave. Why do you think that was?
My view would be that certainly, because it was different in different parts of Wales, for instance. So I think we've seen in the Fro Cymraeg, as we call it, the more Welsh-speaking areas, and Cardiff, which is more cosmopolitan, I suppose, people voted to stay, to remain. And in areas like mine in Wrexham, people voted to leave. And I think what my view would be is there was a lot more influence in terms of tabloid media from the northwest of England in areas like mine, relentless anti-immigration narrative that was really playing a role in people's views on the whole Brexit issue. So it's mixed. It depends which part of Wales that you're talking about. But the conversation that we had before about media is really pertinent, because our media in Wales hasn't been strong enough to articulate the fact that Wales benefited particularly from structural funding, from being part of the EU. And that message just didn't get across. It didn't. But the anti-immigration dog whistle politics from tabloid media did have an impact. And the television appearances from people like Nigel Farage, they definitely were a big part of swaying people's views in certain parts of Wales. So, as I say, there isn't one answer. It depends which part of Wales that you look at, but that's certainly for the northeast would be my take on it.
It's interesting you should say that. Most of my family now lives in Portugal, and I spend a bit of time in Spain, putting it mildly, and speaking to Spanish and Portuguese people, to them it just seems like nuts to leave the EU. They literally do not understand, because they point to the toll roads, they point to the new highways, they point to, and the papers are full of, the EU has granted Andalusia 700 million euros. The Algarve has gotten 300 million euros to do something else, which rather bears out your point, by the way, that if the media coverage is balanced, you get a balanced outcome. But certainly, I don't know anyone here who would vote to leave, for Spain or Portugal to leave the EU. I mean, they look at you uncomprehendingly, as if to say, have you been on some exotic cheroots or what's that? What would you say to that, Llywelyn? Are these people misguided, or?
Well, no. To play devil's advocate on that, and I'm no expert, and I think, as Carrie says, there were different reasons for people to vote leave. Similarly, there were different reasons for people to vote remain. But I think, to play devil's advocate on the funding point, if Wales received a lot of structural funding because we have some of the poorest areas in Northern Europe. But if you're living in one of those poor areas, if you don't have great prospects, then no matter how much structural funding has come in, your day-to-day life has not materially improved because of structural EU funding. And so while it's easy to say, look at all this stuff that EU funding has given you, I think that can sometimes be taken as quite a patronizing view if actually you're living in these areas and struggling from day to day. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Why did Wales vote to leave the EU? Because there are so many different reasons why one may have voted to leave, just as they may have voted to remain. And I think actually trying to look at why did Wales vote to leave, I think it's almost an unfair question with an impossible answer.
Yeah. What did the research indicate? Because I assume there was some research done after the vote, the Brexit vote. Do you know what it indicated in terms of the top three reasons that people across Wales tended to favour to leave?
I mean, I can only tell you what I picked up on the doorstep. I stood in the Westminster election where this was a massive issue, and I was campaigning in areas that were where I am stood as a councillor, traditional Labour areas, who I saw voting Tory for the first time, and the issue was immigration. Undoubtedly, that was the message that people were getting. And although I understand what Llywelyn's saying in terms of areas of deprivation, maybe not seeing the impact of those structural funds. I think there's a wider conversation to have about how those structural funds were spent, because it was very difficult during that conversation to be able to point to things that made a tangible difference in people's lives. So that's another conversation. But I think we failed completely to articulate to the people of Wales the benefits of being in the EU, and we failed because those platforms and those avenues for conversation just weren't there. I think, and it really highlighted that weakness that we have in terms of media in Wales, and the democratic deficit that results when people don't get basic information about how their own country is run. And I think that has to be a major priority for us going forward, is any vote, any issue, that the people of Wales feel that they're informed and that you have that balanced debate.
Yeah, these are good points. I'm intrigued. Why would an anti-immigration viewpoint find resonance on the doorsteps?
Do you know what? It's a really good question, because I remember knocking doors in areas where there were very low levels of immigration, where people were still talking about the immigration argument. And it's that Daily Mail tabloid headline, Nigel Farage platform on Question Time, I would say was the reason behind it. They had those messages relentlessly pushed at them. And as you're saying, in areas that are deprived people, it's always easy to find someone to blame, isn't it? If you can point the finger at somebody else, that's the easy solution. It was very difficult to challenge that during the referendum. Very, very difficult.
What wasn't there perhaps a particular problem in that we now learn that Cambridge Analytica were active? We don't know to what degree, but we do have evidence from the United States that social media was used to a very great extent to micro-target individuals. So, for example, Llywelyn would get a message, if he was in favour of gun control, that Donald Trump was going to take steps to strengthen gun control. You may have been living next door to Llywelyn, and your message from Donald Trump would be, we're going to have to get rid of gun control, just based on your buying habits at Walmart and a few other places. I mean, the likelihood is that and it will certainly apply, I would imagine, the Scottish referendum coming up next year, that social media will be used to a very great degree, much more than overt campaigning, I would imagine. I mean, right now, a lot of political parties spend effort and time producing leaflets and going around doorsteps, and that's all very laudable, but it pales into insignificance if an individual is getting a message directed to them that says, Carrie, Llywelyn, have you thought of the following? So how would you possibly, Llywelyn, compete with the power of social media in the wrong hands?
It's a very good question, and I actually might defer to Carrie, because given your recent experience of social media for the council election, I don't know. I have very little insight to add, so I'm sure Carrie might.
It is a good question. In terms of budgets and things, it is very difficult to compete when you're a smaller party. Where you can compete, though, I think, is if you're a grassroots party and you're campaigning in your community, you have those networks on social media that are plugged in to your community and to the places where the discussion's happening locally. You can't buy that. You can't. If you haven't got your boots on the ground, if you're not active, you are not going to be able to get those messages across to people. So I think that is the huge advantage that we have in our own turf. So the Tories can put, 1 million onto social media campaigning, and they'll have these broad brush messages that will have an impact, but you will not be able to have that local conversation in the same way without that organisation on the ground. So that's the advantage. It is a challenge, and certainly it's a challenge for small parties like mine in terms of budget. But then, you just have to think outside the box. And there are ways around that, I think, that we're starting to use more effectively as well.
Would you hope that the march on Saturday in Wrexham will have an impact on local opinion in that regard?
Yeah, and I'm sure it will. They're not going to miss it, that's for sure. And I think, obviously the whole discussion about the council and permission to march and all of those things have engaged people as well in terms of the whole, debate. Even people who, I don't support independence, but I support the principle of your right to go out and express your view. So it's already, started a conversation locally, and that's what these marches are there to do. They're there to start this conversation, to get people to think about the idea of independence, open their mind to it in a way that, maybe they haven't before. Like I say, for younger people, it's more of a normal conversation. For that general age group in the middle, I think we really need to sort of kickstart that conversation. So I'm already seeing that in terms of feedback on social media locally, and I'm sure there'll be more of it post-March as well.
Well, if it's any help, the opinion polls in Scotland are fairly clear. People over 65 are only 25% disposed to vote yes in a referendum on independence. That's the inverse of people under 25, i.e. under 25, between 70 and 75% are in favour of independence.
I think we're seeing similar levels in Welsh polling as well. So, I mean, in terms of direction of travel, it's very, very encouraging, isn't it?
The question then remains, how do you persuade young people to go to a polling station on a night when the club might be open on a Thursday? I don't know. I mean, sounding really cynical and old now, forgive me for that, but it's a fact. I mean, I've got grandchildren of that age, and they espouse very clear and strong and powerful opinions. But when it comes to the mechanics, they tend to be less enthusiastic. So how do you persuade young people to go along on a Thursday and vote for you?
Llywelyn?
I mean, I was going to say you need to inspire people. I think, one of the reasons why we see low turnouts in all elections, frankly, at the moment, less so or proportionally worse turnout in Senate elections, proportionally worse still in council elections, is because people feel like their vote doesn't matter, that their vote isn't going to change anything. And actually, arguably, when the mainstream political parties are much of a muchness, and when you're going to have another vote in 4 or 5 years' time, actually maybe there's a degree of truth in that. I think when it comes to such a thing as voting on the constitutional future of your country and all of the things that come with that, I think that's how you get people to turn out to vote, by inspiring them that actually this is a chance to have a real impact on, the direction of travel for them and their family and their friends and their children and their children's children, etc. Right? And that actually it's not something that isn't going to make a difference, and this is the thing that will make the big difference.
It's interesting you should say that. My experience, if it enthuses people locally, then that has a big effect on how they might see the bigger picture. And I agree with you. It was often said to me that people aren't enthusiastic. They'll not come along on a Wednesday and listen to a speech. My personal experience, when we had a problem in Fife with a petrochemical plant and the lack of health and safety measures, it was no great effort to get 400 people to turn up. Now, a lot of these people had to make arrangements to have their kids looked after, their dogs looked after. It wasn't just a question of saying, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go along there and listen to these folks talk about it. It was because they were motivated. And the key to all of this, it seems to me, is if you can motivate just really a handful of people. I think Margaret Mead said, you can only possibly influence a small number of people, but thank goodness that's all it really takes. There's a cumulative, a snowball effect, if I can use that crude term, that happens, that somehow, I'm not quite sure what the alchemy is that's involved, but if people think that you represent them, all of a sudden, things change. We've had people saying,
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's demonstrating that actually you can make a difference. And I think a great example of that is and it's absolutely inspirational, but the anti-immigration raids that we've seen from Scotland. it takes a small number of people, a really small, fewer than 10, to begin to make a difference. And once people locally see that they can make a difference, then they go. And together they see actually how much power normal people have. And it's honestly, it's inspirational. And I think, we've seen over the past few years, there is a sea change. I think people are, and particularly young people, are becoming much more politicized. And so, it's incumbent on, those people who are trying to drive this forward to be able to demonstrate that actually, people do have the ability to make change, because we see it every day.
I think we need to modernise the voting system as well, don't we? If we can have online banking, why don't we have online voting? This is a question that young people ask me all the time. I think, it's been slow to catch up with the pace of change in terms of, the internet. So I think that there's a job of work to do there as well.
I think that's a very, very good point. I tried to make a bank transfer this morning, and I was phoned by the anti-scam outfit in the Royal Bank of Scotland, who asked me a whole range of questions about who may or may not have approached me in order to make this transfer. And I was on the phone for 10 minutes with this nice lady from Australia, asking me all sorts of questions about my purchasing habits and what my wife was buying from Amazon. I got the impression at the end of it was less about anti-scamming and more about a fishing expedition, but maybe that's my cynicism showing through again. But I take your point that, if that's the amount of effort that a commercial company can apply, on a somewhat minor part of its operations, and yet can transfer money across the world effortlessly, it can't be beyond the reach of sensible individuals to set up an online voting system. I mean, you're right. It's hard to imagine that. That's too difficult. Were you elected on a proportional basis, Carrie?
No, it's first past the post in terms of council elections, but I've stood. We've got a regional list system in Wales, so I have stood in an election that does work through proportional representation. And obviously, we've got changes to the voting system in Wales come in potentially for the next Senedd election, because the number of members of the Senedd will be increasing. So yes, we could be looking at a more proportional representation system overall, I think.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that in Scotland there are two proportional systems. The MSPs are elected under one system, and I think the STV process is used to elect councillors. We have multi-member groupings in local councils, but one of the criticisms in Scotland is that there isn't much local democracy to speak of. Lots of things are controlled from Edinburgh that many people feel ought not to be controlled from Edinburgh. What's your take on that in Wales?
I think you're always going to have those conversations. So people in North Wales think everything goes down south, and Cardiff's got too much power. I think generally the closer to home decisions are made, the more people feel connected to the process, as a general rule. But yeah, I suppose there's a similar narrative here, and there's always that tug of war, isn't there, between a local government and national parliament.
You argue it's healthy, because the last thing you want is to reproduce what happens at Westminster, where one party controls everything and abuses the Constitution. Kevin is telling me I have to watch my time, and I want to issue an apology if any of you watching and listening tonight have any trouble with what you're watching and listening to. It's because of my lousy internet here, but nothing to do with the quality of the producing team. Thank you very much. I should have mentioned that the hour goes quickly. It has done tonight, but this has been very informative. I appreciate both of you, Carrie and Llywelyn, for joining us, and a big thank you. If you can stick around for a few minutes, concluding remark, I'd be grateful. So let me just bring things to a close here. I'd like to obviously thank Carrie and Llywelyn for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to all of you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed the TNT show. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up. This is the place for big hitters. So remember, look at Indie Live and you'll see that we have a number of guests lined up for future shows. The TNT show will be back at the same time next week when we'll be talking to another major player. As always, please look out for Dr. Elliot Bulmer's column in the Sunday National this weekend. He is the UK's leading expert, in my humble opinion, on the Constitution. You'll find his column in the 7 Days supplement. In closing, a further reminder it's been a great day for British democracy. Here's a question. How many serving British parliamentarians are also Irish citizens? 10, 12, 20, 50? The answer is 321. That means that 321 British parliamentarians have sworn loyalty to the Queen and her successors, while at the same time agreeing to uphold the Irish state and its constitution. Love you. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, please, and take care. Good night.